Thanks very much for being here with us. I'm Raihan Salam, president of the Manhattan Institute, and I'm joined here today by a really genuinely extraordinary group of people. These are three people I've long admired, I've long appreciated, so I'm so excited to introduce them to you, which I will do in a moment. But first, just a couple of thoughts to frame the conversation. Black America is in the midst of a demographic, cultural, and economic transformation. Here's a neat set of statistics. In 1970, roughly 5% of Black Americans were first or second generation. Today, over 20% are first or second generation. In 1980, roughly 4% of Black households had incomes above $100,000 in 2020 dollars. In 2020, over 20% had incomes over $100,000. Between 2010 and 2020, the mixed-race Black population, as defined by the census, grew 88.7%, and it now stands at over 12% of the total Black identified population. In the 1960s and 1970s, the Great Migration from the rural South to the industrial North and West was still underway. In the 21st century, hundreds of thousands of younger, college-educated Black Americans are leaving northern and western cities for booming suburbs in Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas. Against a backdrop of declining segregation and rising intermarriage, the notion that Black America is a monolith is no longer tenable, if it ever was. But what does that mean for the future of Black identity? Can we even credibly speak about a singular Black identity that captures the breadth and complexity of a population that encompasses multi-generational natives, first and second generation Americans, mono and mixed race Blacks? We've gathered three of America's most brilliant and impressive young thinkers to help us make sense of this changing landscape. Chloe Valdery is the founder of Theory of Enchantment, which she describes as a framework for compassionate, anti-racist education that's made its way into companies and schools across the country. A native of New Orleans, her family has deep roots in the American South. Delano Squires is a research fellow at the Heritage Center's Richard and Helen DeVos Center for Life, Religion, and Family. A contributor to Blaze Media, raised in the Rosedale section of Queens, New York, his forthcoming book is on reestablishing the natural family as the foundation of Black cultural and civic life. Mene Ukwe-Barua is an editorial board member at the Wall Street Journal, where he covers labor, business, and politics. Raised in suburban New Jersey by Nigerian immigrant parents, he is a proud product of City Journal and the Dartmouth Review. So first, I'm struck by the fact that the three of you are all people who have a great deal of biblical literacy. Two of you are serious, observant Christians. One of you is someone who is raised in a very serious faith tradition. And I want to talk to you about the religious landscape. When you think about the civil rights movement, this was something that very much grew out of the Black church. Christianity has been a central part of the Black experience. Yet now, when you're looking at younger Black Americans, a quite large and rapidly rising share are unchurched in a way that's affecting civic life in all sorts of complicated ways, including political partisanship. So I wonder, Delano, if you could start us off talking about your thoughts on the Black religious landscape.
Sure. And I'll try to specify when I talk about sort of Black religious landscape, I'll go with sort of the medius part of the curve, right, which is sort of the Black Christian tradition, the Black church, so to speak. I think some of the declines in church attendance and religious observation among Black Americans mirrors what we see among Americans in general. There's been a rise in Americans who don't identify with any particular religion, what Pew calls the nones, N-O-N-E-S. And I think you're seeing the same thing in, definitely among younger Black populations. I think part of the reason, and this may seem counterintuitive, is that the winds of the civil rights movement, I think, shifted what the Black church believed its central role was. And I think it started to focus on social and political progress and less on gospel preaching and Bible teaching. Now, here's the thing. The NAACP can do a voter registration drive. The Urban League can do a backpack giveaway. Your local soup kitchen can do food giveaways and run food pantries. But there's only one institution that is going to preach the good news of Jesus Christ. And if the church is not doing it, that means that it's not being done. And I think what sort of religion in general, Christianity in particular, gives and gave Black Americans of previous generations was a moral foundation as well as worldview formation. The unfortunate thing is today, Black religious Christian observance, particularly people who say like, I actually believe what my Bible says about some of the most controversial things, can be expected to be outcast from the Black progressive mainstream. So some of you may be familiar with Tony Dungy. He's a Hall of Fame coach and NFL football analyst on NBC. He spoke at the March for Life last January, and a Black sports writer named Kevin Blackistone, because I believe in naming names, that's just my personal, prerogative, wrote in the Washington Post comparing him to a white supremacist because he spoke at a march that promotes pro-life causes. And in that sense, I think what you're seeing is the Black church be transformed into a completely different entity. And I believe that's one of the reasons that religious observance has gone down, because politics have filled that void that religion used to play in terms of how people see themselves and how they see the outside world. And unfortunately, and this is the last thing I'll say, one of the things when Nicole Hannah-Jones says there's a difference between being racially Black and politically Black, there's something to what she's saying. I don't agree with that, but I acknowledge the reality that she's speaking to. When you fuse those things like conjoined twins, the church, the Black church, oftentimes comes along and acts as sort of the spiritual guide for that new formation of Blackness. And one of the ways that you see this most clearly is how many Black churches, I'm talking the ones that see economic disparity and systemic racism as the primary problems facing Black America, which is why all of their solutions call for bigger government and better white people. Now, I don't see that as a particularly effective political program, but what you see is how that gets used and turned so that to be politically Black means that you have to affirm all different types of the left's agenda. You have to be pro-abortion. You have to be pro-LGBT. You have to be, environmental justice has to be at the top of your list. And I think that is going to force many Black Christians to choose between their Bible and their Black card. And I'm not sure many people understand how those tectonic plates of culture have shifted in the last 60 years.
Delano, just so I'm entirely clear on this, you're not saying that you believe the role of the Black church is to enforce a different political orthodoxy. Rather, you believe that the mistake was in embracing a certain kind of partisan progressivism as a substitute for biblical Christianity.
Correct. I'm not in favor of left-wing Christianity or right-wing Christianity. I think Jesus is a whole bird type of God. So I don't think there's a need to sort of separate in that sense. But all of the political activity with respect to the Black church basically falls on the left, which means anyone who's center-right can expect to be ostracized because they are still holding to biblical definitions on what I would call sort of the Genesis issues. What is a man? Genesis 1:27. What is a marriage? Genesis 2:24. Does life have inherent value or conditional value? Those are issues that people who hold to sort of a biblical framework can be expected to be ostracized and cast out of polite company within the Black community if they do hold to those positions publicly.
Chloe, your roots in Louisiana are very, very deep, stretching back to the era of American slavery. And you were raised in a deeply spiritual, but also deeply Christian milieu. And now, you live very far away from New Orleans. You're now living in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. And as I understand it, though you don't consider yourself religious, your chief spiritual discipline is Zen Buddhism.
Yeah.
I'm curious, in a sense, you are emblematic of a shift in kind of rising generations. And I wonder if you could talk to us a bit about your religious journey and how it influences how you think about this legacy of Black spiritual life and what it's meant for Black advancement.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in New Orleans, Louisiana. I grew up in a Christian family that observed Jewish festivals, and so my sense of time has been very much mediated by the Jewish calendar. I know that Passover is coming up, and it's very much on my mind. And as a result of living in this way, I grew up with a kind of insider-outsider relationship to religion, so never firmly ensconced within mainstream Christianity, never firmly ensconced within mainstream Judaism, but very much relating to the term Judeo-Christian in a very deep sense. I think in a deeper sense than some other people who may identify as conservative might relate to that term. But as a result of that, I, focused a great deal in college actually on international studies, and I had a pro-Israel club on campus and very much focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is, erupting now. And I also, as a young person, I was actually speaking to some folks about this earlier, in elementary school in New Orleans, I attended Langston Hughes Elementary School, right? And I was exposed to the writings and teachings of the poet Maya Angelou and the Harlem Renaissance thinkers. And so this vision of the North as being this great bastion of liberation, I think was something that was subconsciously sort of planted in me as a young child. And I perhaps inexorably ended up moving to New York and making that great migration. I will say that I think one of the things that is less emphasized when we talk about the civil rights movement and we talk about the leaders of the civil rights movement and the spiritual orientation that they were coming from is that Dr. King in particular, in as much as he was influenced by Protestantism and theologians like Reinhold Niebuhr in particular and Paul Tillich and these various thinkers, he was also very much moved by Eastern wisdom traditions. He was very much inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, and one could argue that his particular brand of Americanism was this great fusion of Protestant theology and the East. And I'm very much interested in the notion of how future generations in the Black community might come to embody that, in the sense that though we are not necessarily active churchgoers, that isn't to say that we will not have a deeply spiritual life, a very rich spiritual life that is as rich as our forefathers and mothers. And just because the church doesn't serve necessarily as the primary institution that animates that spirituality doesn't mean that we will not find that same richness elsewhere. And I suspect that we will find it elsewhere, and I suspect that we will end up building new institutions elsewhere in the near future.
Minay, one of the themes that I'm fascinated by is this theme of how immigration is remaking Black America. And you yourself were raised by Nigerian parents, and you're someone who certainly has many close relationships in that kind of ethnic milieu and that diaspora community. And I guess one big question about the future of Black America is whether or not that ethnic identity, that sensibility, that kind of idea that that kind of linguistic ethnic tradition is what's going to matter most, is going to clash to some degree with the idea of a kind of collective Black racial consciousness. So I wonder how you think about that and how that's played out, not just in your life, but that of other second-generation Americans of African origin.
Yeah, I'll speak first from my personal experience and say that from the time I was a little boy, my father in particular and my mother as well emphasized that we were Black. We were Nigerians, certainly. They were very proud of that, and they wanted to pass on their culture and wanted us to identify with our African roots. But they made us know that in this country, the majority of people who look like you are African American. That's how you're going to be perceived. And that is an inheritance that you should claim. That is an identity that you should claim. And so me and my siblings always grew up thinking of ourselves as Black, identifying with Black pop culture, movies, television shows, music, etc., at the same time that we retained our specifically Nigerian cultural identity. And I think that that's a lot more common than people often anticipate. I mean, if you are in sort of Black political circles nowadays, it is always a topic of conversation because there are a lot more Africans now today than there were a generation ago. And you get little debates and you get little fights here and there. Obviously, there are some differences between the groups and there's opportunities for cultural clashes here and there. But I think the vast majority of African immigrants in this country, it could be first-generation people born here like me, or even people who came here as teenagers or young adults, identify with black culture and tend to affiliate when they come to this country with black groups more so than they would with white people or with other immigrant groups. And I do think that as we go on, that will only increase. That's my sense, that African immigrants will continue to contribute to black culture in a variety of ways. We're already seeing it happen. I think that Afrobeats music, for example, very special to me for a long, long time and used to be kind of a fringe interest. But now, I mean, you walk down the street of any city in America, you hear it. It's become completely mainstream and integrated with the broader black culture. And I think that a lot of towns, and this is probably a topic that we're going to get into a little bit more as the conversation goes, a lot of these regions in this country where you have a lot of the black middle class departing and coming down to places like Atlanta, places like Houston, and leaving the Northeast and the Midwest, a lot of that space is being lifted up by African immigrants who are taking their places in some of these legacy black neighborhoods that used to be predominantly filled by African Americans. I go to Harlem pretty often, and you'll find that you have Senegalese restaurants, hair braiders in a lot of the storefronts now, a lot of businesses popping up, and the integration between the recent African immigrants and the African Americans is very seamless. There are a lot of people who are patronizing each other's restaurants, who are living shoulder to shoulder in the same buildings, and so it certainly is a change to have such a large foreign-born share of the black population, but it seems to be one that is moving positively as of now. There is a natural affinity among the groups, notwithstanding little pop cultural disputes here or there. But I do think that it seems to be coming along very seamlessly, and I'm optimistic about the role that Africans will play in American black culture in the future, and up until now, I believe that American blacks have welcomed Africans with open arms.
Delano, your parents are from Barbados,
Correct.
And you also grew up in Queens, New York,
Correct.
where there is a large population, both of Afro-Caribbean Americans, but also of Americans with deep multi-generational roots in the country, descendants of slaves. And my sense, having grown up in Brooklyn, is that actually there oftentimes was sharp conflict. In particular, I remember intense conflict between Haitian Americans and Black Americans, multi-generational Black Americans. So I'm curious about your perspective on, what I gather from Mene is ultimately a pretty positive story about complementarity and comedy. Is that the story as you see it as well?
For the most part, in terms of my upbringing, I don't remember having any tension with my Black American peers. And I went to enough schools for that to be the case. So I went to 2 elementary, 2 middle, and 1 high school. So I was around a bunch of different people, and I didn't see any tension.
But did you see any folks in the Afro-Caribbean population and the Barbadian population wanting to differentiate themselves, distance themselves from what they saw as a Black American culture that they wanted to be apart from?
There was minimal sort of distinction when I was growing up. And I do think part of this, and this is, if we can sort of dissect with finer instruments, a Black person, a Black kid like me, right? Now Delano Squires is a funny name just because. Not because I'm an immigrant, but just because. But my best friend's wife, before she got married, her name was Stephanie Fisher. She's Panamanian, right? So there's a certain way in which I think it's easier, particularly for kids from the Caribbean, to assimilate than sometimes kids from sub-Saharan Africa, right? Whose names, for lack of a better term, give them away, whose style of dress give them away. So I think there can be a little less tension there. One of the things, and this was a very important experience for me in college. Now again, I grew up in New York. On the low end, I'd figure any Black person you meet in the 5 boroughs, at least a 35% chance they are from the Caribbean or sub-Saharan Africa, right? In Brooklyn, probably more than that. So when I was in college, I would go to parties. That's when I had long hair, and I had my Bob Marley shirt on that you get when you sign up for the credit cards. And and I would have my flag in my back pocket. And I remember Black American friends of mine saying, well, we wish we had a flag that we could carry around like that. We wish we had a culture like that. And what I thought in my mind was, are you guys kidding me? All of my acculturation is within Black American culture. I don't know who the Jamaican James Baldwin is. I don't know who the Trinidadian Jackie Robinson is. But I think there was a sense of alienation and distance that people exhibited then. Now you've rolled forward 20 plus years, and what I'm seeing, and this is the part of identity that I think national identity is important in terms of citizenship for Black Americans, regardless of how long their family's been in the country. When I see Black communities, whether partly immigrant, mostly multi-generational Black Americans in Chicago and New York, standing up to progressive mayors in terms of how they are managing immigration, do you know how hard it is to get Black folk, particularly immigrants in New York, to stand against immigration when they just came here in 1977? So there's a sense of disorder as it relates to our public policy around immigration that I think people are starting to assert a more robust national identity that says, you know, our forefathers built this country, particularly Black Americans, our forefathers built this country, and our politicians have an obligation to us first before anyone from a foreign nation. Here's the dark side of that, and this is primarily online. I'll stipulate that. There is a growing movement of Black Americans. You may hear sort of terms like ADOS, right? American Descendants of Slaves, or you might hear FBA, Foundational Black Americans, of multi-generational Black Americans who want to delineate from African and Caribbean immigrants. The primary motivation for that,
particularly in elite environments where there's a perception, that these are spaces where the Black presence is dominated by first and second generation.
Correct. And the primary driver of that, in terms of what I see online, is the hope that at some point Black folk will get reparations. Because when you want political power, you want to make the Black category as wide as possible. When it's time for someone to get paid for something that happened to their ancestor many, many generations ago, you want to make that pool of people who receive something as narrow as possible. And I think that is something that will only get louder and will move from X and Facebook and other social media platforms out into real life. And again, remember where I started the story. In college, my friends who did not feel a sense of belonging in their own nation, I'm willing to take some ethnic chauvinism. I've been called a tether before, which is a very bad word for people who, families from the Caribbean or Africa. I'm willing to take that if that means that the majority population of Black Americans is not on a suicide mission to destroy the only land that they've ever lived on, that the left is pointing them in that direction. This country was racist from its founding. We need a new founding date. We need a new anthem. We need a new flag. We need new national symbols. And I would much rather people say mean things to me. I mean, I'm a big boy. I got 4 kids. I know about tantrums. I would much rather people say those things to me if it means that they are invested in their nation than want to destroy the thing in order to hope that utopia springs up in its place.
Chloe, I wonder, I'd be curious to hear your perspective on this. There's a Canadian political philosopher, Joseph Heath, who argued that race relations in America have become a wicked problem because there's a deep uncertainty about what exactly the problem is. You'll get people who will agree that race relations are bad, but then there's some who have this implicit view that Black America is a kind of nation within a nation. That's the best way to understand it. A distinct, separate category, like, say, the Quebecois, except that it's not territorial in quite the same way. And therefore, what matters is representation, proportional representation, and actually that is what power ought to look like. There's another view that Black Americans are a minority ethnic group and where the goal is incorporation into the mainstream, fluidity, full participation, the idea that you are not going to be dominated by some master status that is imposed upon you and that kind of comes to dominate the way that you're perceived and the way that you lead your life. I wonder how you think about that contrast. Do you believe that they can be reconciled? Do you believe that we're lacking in clarity on what the right answer is or should be, or do you think that something else is amiss?
Well, it's an interesting question. I would say in the past 4 years, with the rising interest in the diversity and inclusion sort of complex industry, whatever you want to call it, there's been on the left in particular this perpetuation of the idea that Black people are by definition oppressed. And this is problematic because what it suggests is that former category that you just described, but it it ensures that we will always be incapable of experiencing excellence or experiencing achievement in the United States. And so it's sort of a double bind because it presupposes that we are oppressed, but it doesn't. If America is systemically racist, then we will always be oppressed, and we can never actually overcome oppression. And to assert the possibility of Black excellence is itself an affront against that ideology. So I think that there's two things sort of battling each other, two ideologies or two ways of thinking about identity that are battling each other. And primarily on the left, there is this idea, as I've just described it, that might be waxing a bit, or waning rather. But it is, what we need is a kind of politics or philosophy that can advance the notion of Black excellence without it becoming so hyper-particularistic that it makes the left's position inevitable, if that makes sense. So if you were to take, years ago, Jay-Z and Kanye West came out with an album called Watch the Throne. And there's a really beautiful song on that album called Murder to Excellence, which critiques Black on Black crime in many places, but particularly in Chicago. And it's this crescendo that takes place in the song where they move from this commentary on murder in the Black community to excellence in the Black community, the accumulation of wealth and power and influence in the Black community. What is the through line? Is there a through line between the celebration of overcoming that sort of internal violence and the part on the left that says we will always be oppressed and we can never overcome that oppression? I don't know the answer to that question, but there's a symbiosis there, but there's also a tension there that I'm interested in exploring and helping people like reconcile ultimately.
Monet, you talk about as a young person, kind of raised in this family that felt it important that you embrace a Black American identity. At the same time, you grew up in a New Jersey suburb that was dominated by, for example, South Asian folks, Jewish Americans, kind of you name it. It was a very diverse milieu. So with respect to the question that I raised with Chloe, I wonder how you feel about this idea of incorporation into the mainstream. There's an idea afoot that the Black-white binary in American life is now being replaced by a Black, non-Black binary in which people of Asian origin and of Latin American origin are being included into a largely white mainstream, just as Italians and Eastern Europeans and what have you were in earlier eras. But again, the kind of premise here is that still Black Americans are on the margins, right? But I wonder, in light of your experience, talk to me about your kind of subjective feeling about this idea of incorporation into a mainstream. And by mainstream, I mean a world in which you are judged primarily as an individual rather than as part of a group.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I did mention that growing up, my parents made clear that they thought of themselves as Black and encouraged us to think of ourselves as Black as well. But because, as you mentioned, we were not living in predominantly Black communities, for me and my siblings, that process of identification with Blackness was essentially through the things that we consumed, through the culture that we consumed, as opposed to having a group of Black friends and having a kind of natural affinity for that identity through personal contact. It came through the movies I watched, the music I listened to, the books that I read, and it was a very abstract notion that was very much separate from my day-to-day experience where most of my friends were white and Asian. As to the question of a Black separation from the cultural mainstream and how it has maybe lingered longer than people expected it to after the civil rights movement. Assimilation hasn't been as full. Blacks are still much more likely to live in racially separate communities, despite the fact that there are no segregatory laws that sort of mandate that they do. I think that the stark divide that you mentioned between Blacks and other racial minority groups in terms of the rate of assimilation is most clear in intermarriage rates. I think that whites and Asians have much higher, or rather Hispanics and Asians have much higher rates of intermarriage with whites than Blacks do. And there is also a little bit of a neighborhood level separation, but I do think that at the level of socialization, you still do see a slower but still progressing move toward more integration amongst blacks and whites than we historically have had. I think that because blacks in this country have such a long legacy of a specific black American culture, specific neighborhoods that have been black for a long time, our own pop culture, etc. There are reasons why there's a stronger affinity with other blacks and a desire to live in predominantly black neighborhoods, a disposition to marry within the race compared with immigrant groups who don't have those deep attachments, who don't have as solid of an American identity that's separate from the white cultural mainstream. So that's one of the reasons there. But I do think that there still aren't hard barriers to that kind of assimilation, and it is progressing in a lot of places. I've spent a lot of time in the South. My mother, until very recently, lived in Georgia. And when I go down there, I see a lot of interaction among middle-class whites and blacks, more than I do see in the Northeast, actually. And I do think that there is a lot of cultural similarity among sort of white and black Southerners, much more so than you would see in the Northeast or in the Midwest. And so it varies a lot by region. So I do think that the distinction you draw of the kind of unique black separation from the white cultural mainstream is true, but I do think that it differs by region, and it's still decreasing on the whole.
I wonder, before I get to you, Delano, I didn't mention earlier on that, Mene, you are both a devout and also very intellectually serious Catholic. And I wonder, when you're looking at your kind of community of worship, I'm curious how you see racial lines playing out there, if at all. Would you say that this is very much a community where, kind of race really isn't an issue, and that it's something where, it is the kind of Catholic identity that kind of tends to dominate, or has that not been your experience?
Well, it's interesting that Catholic, as many of you know, means universal literally, and that's always been part of the identity of the Catholic denomination specifically, to see no barriers among different ethnic or geographic lines, and it's always embraced the entire world. And so any given Catholic church that you enter, particularly in a diverse place like New York City, is going to have quite a wide array of different groups represented.
And they're deep friendships. I just think about your friendship with your priest. This is something that is an incredibly meaningful relationship, not unlike the relationship with a family member. And yet that's with someone from an entirely different background, which is striking.
I think it's interesting because the history of Catholicism in this country is that it's been very strongly ethnically identified. That you have had, Italians who came over, Irish who came over, Eastern Europeans like Poles, etc., who came over, and their experience of the faith was deeply rooted in an ethnic affinity. But I think that all of these different groups were still observing the faith in a very similar way, particularly at the level of philosophy and theology. They believed the same things about Jesus Christ and about the church. And so as they assimilated into American culture, those barriers kind of very quickly and very easily, I think, evaporated. And you now have a church in the 21st century in Catholicism where there is quite a lot of diversity represented. There aren't not nearly as many black Catholics, but there are some from Africa particularly and from the Caribbean, and who are able to fit seamlessly into the Catholic Church as it exists in the United States today, which is bringing together groups across different ethnic lines.
Delano?
So I want to address the identity formation issue, and I think Chloe mentioned this. I do think that there, for a large segment of Black Americans, and just because the thing is, when particularly for Caribbean immigrants, and that's what I know better, there is a sense of assimilation, and it's actually one of the better examples of assimilation. I saw this in New York, good, bad, and ugly, because if you did an examination, let's say in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, and you looked at the kids, the teenagers who are gang affiliated in the Bloods and the Crips, you are going to get some kids from Trinidad and Grenada and Jamaica and Barbados. So again, good, bad, and ugly. The issue comes, and I think one of the reasons that there is a sense of alienation and sort of separation in the Black population is when you form your identity in oppression and marginalization, it makes it extremely difficult for you to be a good, for lack of a better term, winner, right? In sports, it's much easier to be a loser team because no one has expectations. But the minute you start to win and other teams They start to gun, they bring their A game against you. Winning has a culture. And what I've observed on multiple occasions is you will have, especially where I live now, outside of DC, Prince George's County, when I went to college, University of Pittsburgh, early 2000s, they told me PG County stands for Pretty Girl County, and I said, okay, sign me up. But what kids would tell me is PG County is the richest majority black county in the country. But the kids there acted like they were from inner city DC. So they had a mom who worked at NASA and a dad who was a chemical engineer for DuPont. And they were sagging, they had all the lingo because they were putting on an identity. So if part of, particularly for young men, identity formation is around sort of a street motif, right? Think of 50 Cent versus Barack Obama in terms of racial authenticity. When you form that identity in oppression and marginalization, you have every incentive to throw yourself down. I'll give a tangible example of what this looks like, going back to one of the earlier sessions. If a university is saying, well, don't mention your race, but tell me about some time you've overcome hardship, this is what it'll sound like. Middle-class kid, grows up in the suburbs. Dad is a pastor. Mom is a pediatrician. His dad does prison ministry on the weekends. When it comes time to write the application, he said, I've been impacted because my dad spent a significant part of my childhood in prisons and jails. He's gaming the system. I worked almost 15 years in local government, and the first rule I learned is that wherever there's a system, there's going to be somebody who knows how to work it. And when you feign helplessness, you can't both have black girl magic, and I'm black and empowered, and then also I need to be saved. And I think what the left does, particularly the black folks, is it tries to convince us to be clients instead of agents. And that is why they hate anyone who talks about agency. Because as I said, in the same breath, they'll say white people are the source of all of our problems, but also the people we look to for all of our solutions. And that is a problem if you want to be a people that progresses over generations.
And if I may add to that, I have presented an optimistic picture of the affinity among African immigrants to this country and blacks, but I think the caveat to that, which Delano just touched on, is that admittance into the group for a lot of Africans can, in some places and at some times, depend on affirming that political narrative. So the barrier isn't cultural. It isn't the idea that African Americans are biased against Nigerian immigrants simply because we don't share the same historic legacy, haven't been here as long, have funny sounding names. But the barrier can be if you come as an immigrant and are not willing to take up and affirm that same victimhood narrative, which is pushed by a certain subset of African Americans in this country, particularly in elite spheres. And I definitely did see this in college at Dartmouth, for example, in the black student group. I would say that African and African American students were equally represented. It was mostly concerned with causes, that were specific to the African Americans and politics in this country. But I think a lot of the African American students adopted African motifs and styles and cultures and vice versa. There was a lot of affinity. But you certainly were not welcome within that group if you didn't affirm the victimhood narrative, not just broadly in the history of the United States, but the idea that Dartmouth specifically as an institution and all the colleges are oppressive and are hostile to blacks. And I experienced this firsthand myself. I actually lived at the Black Student Center for one summer when I was on campus and wanted to, because like I said, I didn't grow up in a black community and had never had that experience. I wanted to put myself in a position to form black friendships, and I really did. I think a lot of people probably knew that I was coming from a different political perspective. At that time, I was already a staff member of the Dartmouth Review, which is a conservative paper on Dartmouth's campus, but it was kind of another don't ask, don't tell situation, to invoke a phrase I used this morning. It was kind of I didn't bring it up, they didn't bring it up, we had other things to talk about and to bond about. But eventually that didn't last, because during the time I was on campus was while the Black Lives Matter protests were sweeping through the country in 2014 and 2015, a lot of campuses were having their own version of it, and we had one at Dartmouth where a lot of the students, particularly some of my friends from the Black Student Center, got dressed up all in black, made banners, joined the protest movement, started shouting slogans out front of the library, and then marched through the library and were not only chanting, but were singling out students for harassment, basically. They were particular students, they would corner in the hallways and start asking them to affirm the movement, and it really crossed a line of how people should be treating each other on a college campus. And I wrote about this in the Dartmouth Review and talking in a lot of detail about what had happened and some of the details that hadn't been publicized beforehand. And I was ostracized after that. A lot of the close friends who I had made, it's not as if we got into it with each other, but it was just understood that our relationship had fallen apart after that. And so if there's any barrier to being a fully accepted member in the Black community, particularly in these parts of it that are overtly political, it's often whether or not you affirm certain narratives politically. And if you're unwilling or unable to do that, then you might find yourself standing outside.
I want to talk for a moment about place. We had a conversation earlier today with the economist Raj Chetty, who was just talking about the way that where you grew up can have enormous consequences for your life outcomes. And when you're looking at the Black population, it's striking. A recent report from McKinsey from their Black Economic Mobility Project observed that about 30% of Black Americans reside in so-called megacities. There's another 8-9% or so who live in emerging suburbs and college towns, affluent communities. But then you have a very large group living in smaller, typically stagnant cities, and also in rural areas. Black culture is this incredible superpower, this incredible cultural export of the United States to the wider world. It's something that is incredibly compelling. It's also something that is incredibly urban. When you look at the emerging Black elite, which we were kind of touching on earlier on, this is a group that is incredibly dynamic, highly influential. Yes, you have a victimhood narrative, but when you're looking at objective reality, this is a group that is so culturally powerful, influential, nationally, globally. But I'm curious about that other world, that rural world. So, Chloe, you're originally from New Orleans, but in the wake of Hurricane Katrina, your family resided in Alexandria, Louisiana, and you have a lot of family in Louisiana, both urban and rural still. And I'm curious if you could talk to us a bit about that dimension of Black America, because I guess my impression as an outsider is that that is a part of Black America that's an enormously populous part of it, but that we don't actually hear very much from.
I'm struck by the fact that Beyonce just came out with a country album in response to that question. I experienced Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and my family moved to Alexandria, Louisiana for a year. My grandparents still live there. It's a very rural, I associate it with people hunt. Like hunting is a thing, it's an activity, it's a seasonal thing that people do. People dress up in camouflage, and I had never experienced that before. I'm not sure I can speak, beyond my own individual experience of that, but I can imagine that what we're seeing from a pop culture perspective, and I'm sort of only half joking about Beyonce, right? Like with the confluence of these genres of music that have historically been considered or associated with white culture being sort of becoming more diverse in representation. I think that could be argued an example of how Black American life that is not in the urban cities are becoming far more representative on the national scale. I don't know how that will continue to manifest in the future. It's an interesting trend, though. I mean, I think also, I can't help but remember that when Tyler Perry, with his plays, had various white famous country music singers showing up as guests in the middle of his, Tyler Perry Medea's plays. And I think we're seeing this sort of interesting cultural milieu pop up from those more rural areas. But again, I don't know what the trend line is. I suspect that there is something to be said also about sort of like this conversation that we were talking about earlier about like how do you navigate the through line between Black excellence and this and I'm thinking here of the rapper Killer Mike. I don't know if you can tell, but I think a lot in terms of pop culture. But the rapper Killer Mike is very much, has you could argue, a rural mindset in the way that he shows up, right? In the way that he talks about the importance of the Second Amendment and the importance of defending his home, and yet he sort of dances. I wouldn't put him in the bucket of sort of like we are implicitly or explicitly oppressed or inevitably oppressed. I wouldn't put him in that bucket, but he dances on that line. And he also comes from a rural sort of like background in a way. And so I'm curious if more and more people from the confluence of Black American culture and rural life get platformed onto the mainstream, will we see that tension reconcile? That tension between Black excellence, Black power, Black ownership, and Black oppression. And that's a question that I would be on the lookout for in the next 2 to 3 years.
So we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience, but I do have one last question for you, and I ask that you give me a yes or no answer. So first, do you believe that today we can still speak of a cohesive, singular Black identity in America? Yes or no?
Singular? No.
No.
Yes.
Second question, also yes or no? 10 years from now, 15 years from now, do you believe that we will be able to say that Black Americans, more or less, by and large, have been fully incorporated into the American mainstream, that domain of society in which people are dealt with primarily as individuals rather than as people who are marked by their race? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
No.
Hot damn, I'm grateful to you for being a contrarian, my friend. All right, let's open it up to questions. I see a gentleman back there. Oh, just wait for the microphone, please, sir. Thank you very much.
Oh, I'm so glad to see this generation on stage. Very insightful, great perspective, and especially both native and non-native born in the United States. But what seems to be missing is for those, there's many of us that have made it out of poverty in the Black community and the history of oppression, all that. But this legacy, I call it the biggest elephant in the room. Where I'm from in Minneapolis, and you look in any major city, any given day, 80 to 90% of children would be born without a father in a home. There's this generational welfare of kids that haven't seen what a father is, a grandfather, an uncle, a viable man in their community. It's like the biggest elephant in the room that no one talks about, that is the real driver of this segregated life that we have, not those who've made it out. And that is something that I think that needs to be addressed front end, because I tell you, as a guy just turned 60 years old, I've lived through all this. When I was a kid, 5 years old, 80% of our families were two-parent families. Mm-hmm. And our ancestors who went through the worst, they're rolling in their graves, looking at this idea of baby mamas and baby daddies. This is not this is not the Black community that they came from or wanted for their kids.
Thank you, sir. So we did have a really stimulating conversation about Black family life, Black family structure earlier today, but there's no question that this has enormous bearing on the future of Black identity and much else. So I wonder if anyone would care to field that question.
Oh, absolutely. I think I would love to put a very simple question to the sages of the age, the race commentariat today, and it will go something like this. If you were king of the world and you could choose between rebuilding the Black family, right, in terms of 75%, let's say in 20 years, 75% of Black children are born to married parents, where it was in 65, or a 75% reduction in racism, however you want to define that, which one would you choose? And my contention is that many of the people on the left would go with systemic racism, because they think once we get white people straight, everything will sort of sort itself out for the Black community. And I think in terms of the family issue, there's been a great disservice that our thinkers have done to us. I came across what I feel is like the holy grail of sort of Black inequality data. The U.S. Census Bureau has household income by different categories. Black married couples have a median income of $97,000. The black community in general has a median income of $52,000. The average is about 74. The median for nationally is 74. For whites is about 81. For Asians is 107. But if you just took the black married couples and compared them to other households in general, you would close that income gap almost completely. But the problem is only nationally 47% of households are married couple households. For Asians, it's 63%. For whites, it's 51%. For the black community, it is 28%. So when you lose that family structure and a family culture, there are a lot of consequences that come with that. So I think there's a lot to be done there. I appreciate that comment and that question. And I think I would love to see the Kendys of the world take all of his energy, because priorities are the observed allocation of scarce resources. Political power is a scarce resource. Time, righteous indignation is a scarce resource. And instead of saying, you must declare that Black Lives Matter, I would love for him and his peers to declare Black Wives Matter. And we're going to put a different agenda on the table for the next 40 years.
Just very briefly, Mene, I wonder, when you're thinking about these dramatic changes in family life that have unfolded over the past 60 plus years, I wonder, when you look to the medium-term future, call it 15, 20 years, do you see any positive trends? Do you see any cultural shift towards a restoration of marriage being at the center of family life, or do you not see that on the horizon?
I can't say that I see that, and I don't think that anyone could look at the chart of the trend and see that. There isn't an increase on the horizon. There isn't one already underway. What I was thinking of during the State of the Family panel this morning was, we keep hearing this 70% number. That's the 70% of black children are born out of wedlock. And I think it is really striking that that number hasn't gotten worse over the past generation or so. From the 1960s through the early 2000s or so, the story was that we're in a precipitous decline. Every year you could return to the graph and you would see that the number was ticking down and down and down, the share of blacks who are being born outside of married families. It has stabilized. It isn't getting worse, which I think—
Against the backdrop of a fertility decline, but—
That's true. There are fewer children being born overall, so you could say that that is something that keeps it from becoming even worse. Some of the children who would be born out of wedlock just aren't being born at all. But I do think that we have hit up against a 30% of the black population who are more deeply anchored in creating these two-parent families, who still remain in the church, who have more traditional values. So that decline that we saw was over the people in whom the values were being sort of a little bit more loosely held. And we're seeing the same downward trend in other racial groups today. Of course, it's declining. It hasn't quite gotten to that level. But I do think that if you're looking for optimism, it's that it's been stable. The groups who are still having children in married families probably are doing so because they have strong values and are committed to those. And it's possible, particularly also as we have more African immigrants who also have high rates of births in married families, that will help to be a leaven in the black community. And it's possible that it will start to grow and increase from there.
I wonder if we have a question for Chloe. Please.
Thank you. I really like the question about a cohesive black identity. So I'm sitting here identified as colored at birth, raised in a Negro culture, and have seen these different epochs of blackness, and Afro-American and African-American. And so do you feel like black identity is diaphanous, that it is unstable? What is the next iteration of it, if in fact the foundation has yet to be established as such that we can stay on one version of who we are and we can all be in it?
I'm very curious to hear your answer to this. Thank you for that.
I think that the future, which I am very optimistic about, is that it will convey this ability to be an individual. I mean, again, to go back to pop culture, I think it is fascinating that Candace Owens was just on The Breakfast Club. That is fascinating to me.
So to those of us in the audience who are not familiar with The Breakfast Club,
Not the movie.
So Candace Owens.
I promise you I'm familiar with it.
So The Breakfast Club, this very like impactful, liberal, black radio powerhouse in New York City, hosted by Charlemagne the God, who is this very influential black left-wing powerhouse, hosted Candace Owens, who comes from the Daily Wire and a conservative, outfit. And I didn't watch the entire interview, but I watched some of it.
You do have a job.
Yes, I do have a job, but I watched some of it, and Charlemagne was very deferential and respectful. Compare and contrast that to when Larry Elder was on, and he wasn't none of those things. And so I think there is something shifting, especially in the conversation about DEI right now, where there's a rich, robust conversation across the political spectrum in the Black community about what is terrible about DEI, what should be salvaged with DEI, how can we come up with something better, so on and so forth. And I think that is a sign that the identity that we're moving towards is not monolithic. It's going to have way more space for people to disagree with each other without being called Uncle Toms and without being accused of, selling out the race. I already see that happening right now, this month. So I think that is that diversity within the Black community and being allowed to show up as an individual within the Black community, that is already starting, and I think it's going to increase in the near future.
Please,
No, I was
briefly.
I was going to say, I see something slightly different. Even after the Candace Owens interview, there were a number of articles in sort of Black publications that were asking, why are these radio stations, why are these personalities platforming Candace Owens? She spreads hate. We shouldn't sort of negotiate with hateful people. And I will know when Black identity is sort of moved past its political phase when I go to a museum celebrating African American history and Clarence Thomas has as prominent a place as Thurgood Marshall. We are not there yet. So.
Fascinating conversation. Here's my question. I don't have the data on this, so it's a perspective question, understanding that Black folks are not monolithic and there's a lot of diversity, but there are some broad conditions that I think are more applicable and accurate. So, for example, there's some just negative traits and features in the larger Black culture, glorifying violence, celebrating ignorance, rewarding bad behavior. And I'm wondering if you all, one, agree that, because there's this like cool factor. It's like cool to be bad and it's not cool to be smart. And I'm doing everything that I can to counter that narrative and that condition. So one, do you agree? What are you all doing in your personal lives to combat this condition? And is there anything you can imagine doing collectively that would make a difference?
Yeah, I certainly agree in terms of the observation that the shaming mechanism within the Black community needs to be completely recalibrated. When an artist shows up half naked at an award show and is celebrated, and a Black public figure somewhat expresses admiration for President Trump, and the latter person is castigated publicly, and the former person is celebrated, that to me tells me that something is off. And I say this all the time, particularly when it comes to hip hop culture. I grew up in New York in the 90s, so I'm very much ensconced in that. The only thing that sort of the Black left polices is, from their perspective, wayward political thought. You can talk about violence, drugs, sex and sexuality, all those, you can promote them, you can make them sort of mainstream, right? But as soon as you say, I actually wrote a piece for the Blazer that said, if we want to stop some of these artists, the quickest way is for them to put on a MAGA hat. Because then the community would say, oh, now they say, well, we celebrate her, she's sexually liberated. But then when you do that, you say, oh, why are we listening to artists? We shouldn't listen to rappers. So I do think there's something to be said for that. What I do to combat that is to try to embody the values that I believe in. And for me, for instance, a true Black Lives Matter movement would be internal first, would be sort of biblically rooted, because you can't know who you are until you understand whose you are. So I try to embody the things that I promote, and I never defend things that I can't promote. So if it's not good enough for my kids, if I wouldn't co-sign in my house, I'm not telling you to accept it in your house. And that is one of the biggest problems that I have with the mainstream Black left. There's a reason they don't drive the Who's Your Daddy DNA truck around Martha's Vineyard, because everybody knows that family formation, it drives around the South Bronx. Ian knows this very well. But they don't do it in Martha's Vineyard. So they practice marriage before carriage in Black elite spaces, but they co-sign and run cover for a different method of family formation everywhere else.
Chloe, I gather you have a pretty different perspective on this. You're someone who is a brilliant writer, but you've also dedicated your time and energy to building a business that's about reconciling divides. It's very clear that Delano has a really forthright perspective on these issues. He has a very firm sense of who's right and who's wrong. You're in the business of actually trying to empathize with folks that we might disagree with on this or that issue. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm actually curious, Delano, who are you referring to when you say the Black left in particular? Is it because, again, when I think about an outfit like the Breakfast Club, which has a lot of impact and a lot of cultural influence, I do see them, yes, platforming artists that traffic in misogyny and absenteeism and things of that nature. But I also see them having robust conversations with people, Black men in particular, who are active in the community, trying to combat against some of those very same trends. And so I think that there's a way in which I certainly used to be, a quote unquote political activist. And there's a way in which when I was a political activist, and a conservative one in particular, I only saw things through the lens of political activism and only saw things through the lens of sort of like my set of points that I'm trying to say and articulate versus your set of points on the left that you're trying to say, and I wasn't really attuned to the nuanced conversations that were still happening on these very same platforms that I was castigating or caricaturing as exclusively the left. So I would say I would argue that there is a very robust conversation happening in these spaces, including in spaces that we might regularly or easily castigate as like the other, and that's a missed opportunity because those places are ripe for conversation and for potential reconciliation. I mean, I don't know if you just saw J. Cole apologizing. Sorry, J. Cole, famous rapper, super prominent in the African American community, had a diss track against Kendrick Lamar, another super famous rapper, Pulitzer Prize winning hip hop artist, and then apologized for it and said we shouldn't be going after each other. We should actually pay some respect to each other. And this is a huge deal in a community where there's black on black violence, where there's gang violence, right? And this is happening this isn't like a political conversation, right? It's happening in a different sort of lens. And so I would just caution us to have our ear open and attuned to the fact that that is happening and say how can we lift those voices? How can we make sure that we're talking about the implications of that in our more overtly political conversations?
Everyone, I'm so grateful to you for your time, I'm just grateful. I just want to say we've had so many luminaries, we've had so many important voices, but I promise you, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, you're going to remember having been in the room with these three extraordinary young thinkers and leaders. Thank you guys.
Thank you.